What was the first problem that you saw that you really wanted to tackle?
It's not usual or common to see a Venezuelan entrepreneur in the smart cities space.
It's insane. It's insane.
Yeah.
Why these businesses? Why smart cities? Where did this come from?
The context that you play in changes constantly.
And what's the impact of that purpose on the people who work for you? Welcome back to Mork Unfiltered, folks. Today's guest is someone who embodies resilience, vision, and the courage to build against all odds. Juan José Pocaterra is the founder and chairman of Vikua, recognized by Forbes as one of Latin America's 30 most promising companies, as well as the co-founder and CEO of Wawa, a transit tech startup transforming commuting across the emerging world. From Venezuela to La Coruña, Spain, Juan has navigated political and economic instability, scaling companies across borders while staying rooted in a bigger mission: building smarter and more sustainable cities. Juan is also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, a Harvard Kennedy School alum, and most inspiring of all, folks, a husband and co-founder who built La Wawa alongside his wife. And let me tell you, this is no easy task. I have been there, and this is Herculean. Juan's story isn't just about entrepreneurship. It's about perseverance, partnership, and proving that innovation can thrive even in the most challenging contexts and the most challenging countries. Juan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Patrick. I'm so glad to be here. And yes, I guess you say, been there, done that with doing a startup with your wife.
Yeah, I would say in my case, I've been there and tried that. I wouldn't say that it ended up very well. But hey,
Exactly.
It's like making an omelet. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. So
Exactly.
in this case,
Exactly.
we broke a few eggs, and we'll have to try again at some point.
The funniest part is everyone asks me what's the hardest part of that. And I always say it's that I have to say yes, both at home and at work all the time. So
that is brutal. That is brutal. Yeah, but you learn a lot about yourself, and I think it's very admirable. It's very difficult. You don't often hear of entrepreneurs who do things with their partners. It requires a very fine balance. So we will definitely get back to that because I have a number of questions around that. But as we get started, and I think of the work that you've done at Vikua and at La Wawa, the number one question that always comes to my mind with entrepreneurs, and in this case, in your case, is why this business, right? Why these businesses? Why smart cities? Where did this come from?
Yeah, I've reflected about that for quite some time because I tend to get this question, especially. It's not usual or common to see a Venezuelan entrepreneur in the smart cities space. You don't get to, it's more of businesses, maybe more kind of on the e-commerce and services industry than something as complex, as you would say, in smart cities. And obviously because Venezuela is not known for that. And the truth is that I think that is precisely the reason. I'm a graduate. I graduated, majored in economics and law. But I've always been a tech buff, even since I was little. And to be honest, I think that combination of studying economics and law gave me a perspective into saying, there is a public side of things that tend to be delivered in the city level that are not working in my country. And certainly it's not only a problem of my country. They're not also working in most of the global south and the emerging world.
I agree with you.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that led me, coming from the context that I come from, which is, the Venezuelan crisis where most of public services don't work or have not worked for several years, to say, well, someone has to do something, right? And for most of my generation back in the country, that was getting into politics. And for me, it was about, well, how do we, if everyone does that, fine, I don't have any issue with that. But then who's building the businesses that are going to create the new layers of services that will change that dramatic context of having an infrastructure in our cities that doesn't work, and that leads us to, have this paradox in which we are the most urbanized region in the world in Latin America, but one of the most unproductive ones. And from an economic point of view, that kind of blew my mind. It was like, what? How can this happen, right? How is it possible that if supposedly cities are part of what delivers growth and allows societies and countries to grow economically, why isn't it happening in our countries? And then that led me to thinking, look, it's a matter of there are not enough offerings and services and value propositions that try to understand the city in itself to understand the individuals working around it and in it, and at the same time building the next layer of infrastructure, because certainly that's not going to come from the public side. It's going to come by a mix of public and private, and that's where I landed into Vikua, and then obviously into like literally providing services on the streets, which is what we do with Wawa.
What was the first problem that you saw that you really wanted to tackle? What was the thing that gave you like this like burning urgency to solve a problem?
So the first one was traffic. My first
Right.
company,
My
I
God,
started.
we could talk about that for hours.
Yeah, exactly. So at that time, it was 2010. I remember perfectly. I was ending up the second degree law. I was in the final year. I had started a small business. So just fun fact, my first entrepreneurial endeavor was a kiosk, literally selling magazines and candy in the streets. Not in the street, in a mall, but it was like a small shop in a mall.
Okay.
After that, I started a donut factory. For some reason, that didn't work out. That was with two friends and I, and just suddenly at 6 months later, it just blew up. And then, to be honest, that was a time, that was 2010, where traffic was really heavy in Caracas, and every city that I visited, I was a Model UN guy in the university, so I tend to go to different, right, to different cities in Latin America and the US to participate in these models. And I saw, well, Mexico City had a huge issue. You went to Bogota and it was the same. You went to Lima in Peru and it was the same. I was like, why does this happen, right? Why isn't someone solving this structurally? And that's when I started my first company, which was called Grupo Intec. And what we did was we developed a software that took, at that time, Waze didn't exist, and traffic data as we know it today was not as common and as accessible as we have it today at the palm of your hand in Google Maps.
Yeah.
There were efforts happening, but it was a very kind of up and coming technology of having real time traffic data. So we started to work with GPS companies that, for security and safety purposes in Latin America, so that you wouldn't get your car stolen, or if you did, you would be able to recover it. They would have a localized information on a bunch of cars in the street. So we partnered up to gather that information, and also we created a software that allowed for that information to be input into a software that managed traffic lights in a street. And we created that kind of remote control system of traffic lights in cities. We implemented the first one in Caracas, the first one in the country that was even developed in the country. And then we scaled up and we managed to achieve 21 cities in Latin America using our technology.
Very cool.
And so it was traffic. I mean, for me, it was how it's crazy to think that someone, the average time spent in traffic, it still is a little bit larger actually today, but in Latin America, but the average at that time was 3.28 years of a person's life were spent in traffic. That's just crazy.
It's insane. It's insane. Yeah. And I mean, it continues to be very problematic. I mean, I live in Miami, and, post-COVID, traffic has gone through the roof, as well as everything else in Miami. And people are losing a lot of time unless they figure out a productive way to use traffic, like listening to this podcast. But, people are losing years of their life, right? They're losing years of their life in traffic, for sure.
In a very inefficient activity, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so you started with these, you started with the software, you start with the kind of remote management of these traffic lights. Then, eventually you started Vikua, you started La Wawa. At what point did you kind of have this epitome, like this vision and this realization that, hey, this isn't just about traffic or transportation. This is really about the future of how we want to live in cities.
Exactly. So the interesting side is that this is the compound effect of the entrepreneurial journey being a matter of perseverance and keep pushing forward in something that you're passionate about. So as I mentioned, we were, it was traffic, right? And it was traffic pertaining to how we manage travel times of cars on the streets, right? That's what we tried to solve. Right. And that led me to interact quite often with majors in cities of Latin America, from Oruro in Bolivia to San Pedro Sula in Central America. So I did have the time to connect quite a lot with these user persona, which were the mayors of cities. And listening
the
to
guys
them,
running the political establishment.
Exactly. Running the political establishment, and at the same time, I think it's one of those figures in the political structure and governance of countries in Latin America that it's the closest to providing services and delivering those services to the population, because
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
kind of the lowest one and the closest one to the people in that sense. So I always say that they're like a the janitorial post of the administrative structure of governments in Latin America, because they have to deal with these communities that are very critical at some point of how you do things, and you need to manage these resources, which are the ones that impact the most your livelihood on a daily basis. Because then on the national level, you tend to do more kind of general policy, macroeconomics. These guys have to be sure that the trash in the street is picked up every day of their of person's life, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And talking to them was really interesting because for most of the Americans, politics have not solved and public policy has not solved most of our issues, right? And that has led to a crisis of trust in politicians and their possibility of doing things right. And then you
Yeah.
have corruption, and then you have several other issues that come with that, or there are other cause of that lack of trust. But talking to them, I never found one guy that after going out of that meeting, I wouldn't have the feeling that he really wanted to do things right.
Interesting. So it's people who really care, right?
It's people who care.
Right.
I mean, then obviously not a lot of them I got to meet, for several times. It was just one time. But every time I came out, I said, look, these people care. For some reason, they care. And they're here because they care. And when you talk to them, most of the time, I found out that they were making decisions every day that affected that infrastructure and those city services on a daily basis for millions of people without a single shred of information and data that would really be valuable for them to make that decision. Because the bureaucracy, the structures, everything that they have to organize and manage, it's like any medium to large size company in the US. I mean, you're talking that if you're a city like Oruro in Bolivia, 200,000 people, no one knows that city, that mayor is managing $80 million a year in budget. I mean, how many companies you have in the US, or what size of companies you have that, have of revenue $80 million? It's not like a small mom and pop shop, right?
Right.
It's already
right.
a sophisticated company. So
Yeah, exactly.
if you do that transition to public service, I found out that it was a lack of information and tools. Then other problems, but one of them was a lack of information and tools and the understanding of the contextual reality on a daily basis of urban services. And that's why we created Vikua, which the whole objective of Vikua is precisely to gather that data from different silos that you have in the city, both on the private and the public sector. In the public sector, between different secretaries, I have this amazing case with the former mayor of Quito in Ecuador. He asked us to work with him on a problem on the public schools and a program that they have of nutrition for the public school students. And they had this issue where they didn't measure and did not know how it was impacting those kids' lives. And the only reason why that happened was because the Secretary of Education of the city and the Secretary of Health, which is the one that did the nutritional program, the food program, they were not sharing data. So every time you got kids coming into school in September, around September,
yeah,
the Secretary of Health would get that information to create a baseline study in January. So you already lost 4 to 5 months of measurements that was critical for you to understand where you needed to put more or less resources to generate that impact.
Yep.
If you start to execute that program, the school year ended in June, you already, were only 2 or 3 months that you were able to really modify the policy that you had. So it was a matter of asymmetry of information and data. So we created this platform to basically easily connect into data sources from multiple legacy systems and from multiple structures, put it together and create like an integrated visualization of what was happening on the city in real time. And we provided that to majors, and then we transitioned into making that for private companies that also saw value in that information.
Okay.
And finally, that led to Wawa, because I said, if you follow this thread, it was traffic. From traffic, I found out that it was a lack of information. And then with the lack of information, with all the data that we were gathering, we understood that there was a lack of infrastructure.
Exactly. Sure.
And because everything was really tailored in the case of traffic to the private vehicle. And that's when we said, well, someone needs to refigure how do we think of mass transit from a private kind of perspective and shared economy and platform approach that has not happened yet because most of the mobility companies, which are on the ride hailing spectrum in Latin America at least, have been concentrated on how to make more efficient the use of the single car, but not on the
Exactly.
large vehicles that move
Yeah, very
people
good point.
around and make it affordable. So that was
Very good
kind of
point.
the way
That's
that
the
we
arc.
transitioned. Yeah,
That's the
exactly. That's the
journey.
arc.
So it's like you went from software and kind of like remote management of the traffic lights to kind of like aggregating data for the governments to all of a sudden
Exactly.
figure out that the major problem is kind of like that last mile of transportation, that public
Exactly.
facing transportation for the masses, right? And it was
Exactly.
funny because when I visited your country, I was in Venezuela last year. I was invited to give the closing keynote at one of the universities there at the Startup Venezuela Summit, and I used your service. I used La Wawa.
Nice.
Actually. I was in La
Amazing.
Wawa, and so it was funny because when I met you in Guatemala, I was familiar with the service. I had interacted with the company. I was like, oh, this is really interesting. You know, I was like, we could probably benefit of things like this in the States too.
Exactly.
So when you look at a country like Venezuela, right, and obviously, you know, Venezuela, when you ask the average Joe or Jane in the States, they don't know much about it. They only know what they read in the news, or you know
Exactly.
that Trump is sending airplanes or whatever near Venezuela to do whatever he's doing. You know, and we unfortunately we see Venezuela from more of a negative context in terms of politically what's happened and the challenges in the country. What from an entrepreneurial perspective, right? As a founder, what were some of the biggest obstacles that you faced getting a business started in Venezuela?
Right. So I would say that the first one is definitely the lack of an ecosystem that supports you, right? So that means not only, by the way, I'm not only talking about fundraising and money, which obviously there is a lack of, or there was a lack of in Venezuela. It has gone a little bit better because these pioneering companies, me along others, entrepreneurs from Venezuela that have kind of shown that there is a path that you can build as an entrepreneur, and there is funds that you can raise to make a profitable business. Well, that has been in the last years, right? At 5 years ago, that didn't even exist. So the first one is a lack of ecosystem, where that's a lack of know-how. These mentors, coaches, people like you that can help you understand and navigate these complexities are not necessarily there. So you feel the entrepreneurial journey is lonely most of the time, and in this case, it's much more. You feel that much more in that space because there is no ecosystem. You're creating it as you go. The second is the problem of the private endeavor as something valued in the country. So for a lot of years in Venezuela, there has been this conflict between the good or the bad that entrepreneurs and businessmen are in a general sense. And that has gone into the political agenda. In the last years, that has shifted because I think people understand that you need creators, you need entrepreneurs, you need builders, you need businessmen to deliver goods and services into the economy so that it works out. And the government has understand that too. So that has also changed, but that was a challenge because you were working against the kind of the paradigm that existed in terms of how valued you are as an entrepreneur in all spaces.
Right.
I mean, for
Right.
employees, because even bringing in employees when there is a lack of trust on the entrepreneurial mindset and endeavors, then that makes it hard for you to bring people into new upcoming startups that you are creating.
Right. Right.
And then the
So
third, I would say, yeah.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, and then the third obstacle is when you try to go out and say that you are building something in Venezuela, because it seems like, first, if you're doing it, then you're of the people that have stayed and you agree with everything that's happening there, right? And so and that enters a very complex scenario where you're like, no, I want things to be better, and I'm building things that make it better, and that's what I believe in. And then the second is that the second angle of that is, obviously, if you're growing in Venezuela, like a lot of companies are, and many of which we saw, or some of which we saw in Volcano, you and I that presented during Volcano, well, then the issue of you going out and having your revenue and your operations in Venezuela still for the institutional investors and for the global startup ecosystem is still looked like frowned upon. I don't know if it's frowned upon in the sense that you're doing something wrong, but it's not
Yeah.
valued as a place that someone can thrive in and from.
Right. Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, I think it's you know, it's not intuitive when you think about startup success stories to think of
Exactly.
companies coming from Venezuela. I mean, for me, it was
Exactly.
new, right? Last year was the first time that I was really exposed to it. You know, I was in Volcano. I met this man, Esteban Torvar, who is
Yeah.
president of a company in Venezuela. He's the organizer of the Venezuela Startup Summit. And he approached me and he said, we really need somebody like you to come and speak to these young people. And my initial gut reaction was like, Venezuela? I was like, what's going on in Venezuela with startups? Is this something that I want to spend my time on? And then I met, Pedro from Cachea,
Yeah.
and I met Alfredo Ramonde, who of course is Venezuelan, but who started Papa.com
Exactly.
here in Miami. And I heard some of the success stories, and I've hired a number of Venezuelans. Like my last startup in Chile, my co-founder was Venezuelan. My first employee, was Venezuelan. My accountant was
Yeah.
Venezuelan. So I've had very, very good experiences with Venezuelans. As I was like, you know what? If I can help, if I can give back to the country, I'll go and I'll give a speech, right? And I
Definitely.
was really surprised by what I found, because the interesting thing about Venezuela is like, and I kind of joke about this, but you need to be entrepreneurial to survive in that country, right? It's
Exactly.
like it's hard.
It
It's
really,
hard. I
really it
mean, I
is.
was hearing stories from a guy who worked for me, and he's like, oh yeah, I wasn't able to upload the file last night, and I was like, well, why not? And he was like, well, because they stole my internet antenna, and I was like, what? So you hear these stories which are unbelievable,
Yeah.
but they're true, and it's
Yeah.
just a fact of like living and doing business in Venezuela. So looking back at your roots as a Venezuelan entrepreneur at the early days of being a founder, what kind of advantages and strengths did you get from that? I mean, when we think of the challenges that you have in Venezuela, which are definitely some challenges that you
Yeah.
do not have in Silicon Valley or in London or in Madrid, in your case in La Coruña, right? What were the advantages or strengths that you think you got from being an entrepreneur in a country like that?
So the first one is that I think you don't take anything that comes at you personally. I mean, you're
Right.
already in the middle
Exactly.
of hurricane, right? And
Yeah.
you're like, okay, I need to survive. I need to go out. I need to do things. The context that I'm given to, it's not. I mean, that doesn't determine anything for me because I need to work every day to change that reality, and that's true for any Venezuelan living in Venezuela, probably living abroad, but I mean, in Venezuela, you get to experience it as you mentioned firsthand. Then the second is obviously creativity because you always know that there is something new and that you need to push a little bit the boundaries of what you thought were the rules of the game. And you see it in our economics. In the end, when you have, for example, a country that has had hyperinflation, the creativity that you need to offer goods and services and to adjust to that, when we're talking about that, prices can change from
Yeah.
1 hour to the next. I'm not talking about
That's
days,
crazy.
from
Yeah.
hours to the next. That
Yeah,
means
yeah.
that the context that you play in changes constantly. You do on I mean, you kind of get in your DNA that constant change approach, which in an entrepreneurial journey is something that you need as a strength if you want to survive and you want to kind of discover the way of moving forward and growing. And then the third is, I would say, you get to value a lot that every problem brings huge opportunities. And that seems like a cliche, but I think that what I want to convey is that when you see such need around you, you
Mhm.
understand that it's not in the world. It's not about it staying passive. When facing those realities, it's about trying to do something for that and changing it and working towards it every day. And it's so visually impactful when you go out and, for example, there's no internet or there's no electricity or there's no water that you say, okay, yes, I can complain every day. That's not going to bring anything in. I have to build and I have to do and I have to kind of move forward and drive solutions. So I do think that in these type of countries where there is a lot of need,
Yeah.
in your gut, that turns you into an entrepreneur, even if you don't want to, because
Yeah.
it shows you that when there is a problem, there is probably someone that wants to solve it, and there is a way to solve it that is different to how things are being done constantly. So I would say those are the three strengths that you get. Obviously, it has its downsides too. I'm not saying
Of
that
course.
everything is peachy and
Yeah.
glorifying that reality, but I do think that those are the positive things that you get. And the reason why, the fact that people like you and what Esteban is doing in Venezuela, and you coming as someone that has this journey and that understands and it's part of the global ecosystem and helps us connect with that reality, also shows that, it brings a little bit of attention that sometimes I think also in the VC world and in the global entrepreneurial space, we need to give a lot more chances to entrepreneurs in places like this, because those understand, and first, those are very sensitive with the resources that you give them, because you need, I mean, you know that is scarce, and since
Hmm.
it's scarce, you work with every penny and you fight for every penny. And then the second is that you value when someone supports you, and you're going to give your heart for that to work out. So I do think there is a kind of a call, and we need to be more vocal about how that system can see a lot more, or more into the opportunities and entrepreneurs that are coming out of complex places, even if they are
Right.
frontier markets or markets that are very risky.
Right. It's interesting, and you when you and I met in Guatemala, we talked a lot about this stuff, and obviously talking about it now, it's obvious to me how passionate and determined you are about trying to make these urban communities better places, right, for people. How important do you think it is for an entrepreneur to have clarity of the purpose and a burning reason for doing what they're doing, as opposed to so many entrepreneurs you come across, particularly in this country, in the United States? Everybody's building something with AI because they think AI is the next gold rush, right? So it's everything is AI, AI, AI. And you have people, cranking out business plans and pitches and building stuff. And a lot of them, especially young people, they do it because they want to make a lot of money. In your experience, how important is it as an entrepreneur to be guided by a strong sense of purpose, as opposed to be guided by money or just building the next unicorn?
So first, I don't think they're divorced, right? I don't think they're mutually exclusive, in the sense that, but I would like to think maybe it's the positivist in me, that you do need to be driven by purpose to also make money, right? It's not just a matter of transactionality, even though there are people that probably are very successful in terms of money impact by only doing a business and maybe not caring about the purpose behind it. But to be honest, I think it's a fact that when you're building something that it's for the context of places like Latin America, you do kind of create some empathy with the reality of people around you, right? And again, I think what drives that purpose, or what that purpose drives in you, is that when someone is telling you no, because places like Venezuela and most of the Latin American countries, they are structured to fail. And I know it's hard to hear that. I mean, and to say it as a as a Latino, it's hard to say this, because the world is not, it's competing against you, and you're losing that fight. Yeah, I mean, you're you're
Yeah.
you're you're staying behind, and with
Yeah.
every kind of push that the world makes, if those structures are not working towards advancing, you're expanding that gap. So everything is set to fail. And I think part of the purpose and what it drives in you when you're following it is that you become, I would say, obsessed and even very stubborn, in the sense that you say, look, I have to make it. And it's not because I want to be a billionaire, which I do, and I want to bring billions to my investors and to the ecosystem, and I want to be successful in the kind of the traditional sense of the word. But it's because I do feel that that's a calling, and I have a responsibility. And so in the end, what I'm trying to say is that purpose ends up becoming a huge responsibility, that you're gratified by fulfilling it and by following it, because you enjoy and you're passionate about those issues. But in the end, you do understand that if you don't do it, then maybe you're there, maybe that when you say someone else will do it, might not be true. It might be that you are the only person there that has the guts, the stamina, that's breaking that ceiling that our countries have, to
Right.
push that forward. And
Right.
and well, in the end, for me, that's a huge motivation every day, to
Hmm.
to make it work, and then to go out in the street and say, look, what else can I do? How can I change? How can I pivot? How can I grow the business that I have to fulfill that purpose of helping those other people also break their glass ceilings that they're not seeing and they're not able to break by themselves.
And what's the impact of that purpose on the people who work for you? Like if you look at the average person at La Wawa, maybe working in a call center or driving a bus, or I guess the question is how well do these guys understand the purpose of La Wawa as a company, and what's the effect on getting the best people or retaining top talent when you have
Yeah.
a strong
I
purpose
mean,
like that?
without being, kind of giving a pat on our back in that sense, because I always tell my team that anything that you value positively, it's only 30% of what you are set to achieve. So you have to kind of question whether you are fulfilling that. I feel that our team and the stakeholders that we have, whether it's a Wawa partner, which is the owner of the bus, the Wawa driver, which is the driver of the bus, sometimes they're one and the same in the case of someone that owns their own bus, the users, the companies that we work with, the team that works in Wawa. We're still not at the place where I think they're extremely like 100% connected with the purpose, because we're changing a lot of their mindsets. Like we're educating every day of what it means to solve such a massive issue as it's a commute problem for people in our cities. And that's tough, right? But I do think that when you kind of peel that onion and you start to go on the layers of why they're also working with us and why we've been able to bring amazing talent in Venezuela and abroad, why we've been able to expand into 3 countries and bring amazing stakeholders as investors also and as clients, like large corporates that kind of trusted us very quickly. It's because it takes me back to the mayors that I talked to. I do believe in the good heart of everyone wanting to do something good in every day they come out of their houses. And I think we give them that space. I think what they do know, I don't know if they follow the purpose and they understand it fully and they live it, but I do think that they see in Wawa that they're driving change. How
Right.
much, and if it's exactly the purpose, the type and the size of the change that I have envisioned in my mind and in my heart and with the rest of the co-founders, I think still not. There is work to be done. But I do think that they feel that in Wawa there is a space to create value and to do things good or do something good for the rest of the people around them.
There's kind of like this feeling that it's not just a paycheck. You're actually doing something good for society. You're actually doing something meaningful. Right?
Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, this obviously because I hear it from when I talk to a user that it's on the bus or the driver, that's what they tell you. I mean, they're
Got it.
glad that they're able to do something good for someone else.
Okay. And just for our listeners out there, can you just very briefly explain what it is that Wawa does as a
Right.
service? What is Wawa?
Right. So we're an employee benefits and corporate mobility platform. And what we do is we build private networks of fixed routes, buses and vans going around the city so
Mhm.
that your employers can pay for their employees to commute on and do the home to work and work to home. And
Okay.
once you are on board and you kind of book your trip in our app to go on the bus at 6 a.m. to go to your office, or going back home at 5 p.m. and returning back
Right.
home, and you're sitting in our infrastructure, we start to enable a series of layers of services on board
Okay.
to upskill you and improve your daily lives. So that means, for example, doing mindfulness training when you're going back home in the afternoons. That means doing English classes on board in the mornings when you're going to the office so that you can access a new market or scale in your work in a new position. Or that means, for example, accessing discounts at certain stores that are part of our network around the city so that employers can give you, for example, on the monthly paycheck, you get also a complimentary discounts on several stores around the
Very
network.
cool.
So it's a matter of how do you use mobility as a wedge, as an entry point to provide new timeframes of services and layers of services for those individuals that most of the time are rushing every day to fulfill their daily activities and chores.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool. I remember when I was at Google, one of the things that I most liked, and I didn't always use it because I owned a car and I had a nice car, and so I like to drive. But they had the Google Shuttle, right? And so you could take the Google Shuttle, which would drive through Redwood City, and then you could take the shuttle, and they had Wi-Fi, and then you could chill, and you didn't have to worry about traffic, and there were other Googlers on board that. And I always thought that that was a really cool perk to have, and something which You guys took it to the next level, which is of course adding services on that bus ride, meditation or learning a language. What a great way to leverage the time, right? I think.
Yeah. But to
I
that
think that's a
point, I mean,
wonderful
what we're
idea.
trying to do is exactly making it that, I mean, I've always heard from Google employees that they really value that, as you mentioned, and it's
They do.
something that you kind of feel like, I'm in
Yeah.
Google, right? And I have these
Yeah.
services that are amazing. What we're trying to say is, how do we scale it so that this is not something that's only for a Google employee? It's something that also accessible to and affordable for the rest of the population. Because definitely, I always tell the HR departments, and that's when I find out that everyone wants to do good, and that's what they feel can be done through Wawa, is that they, in the end, I tell them, look, you're asking your employee from 9 to 5 to be good, to retrain themselves, to be happy, to talk with the rest of
To
the
be perfect.
to be perfect in 8
Yeah.
hours. In 8 hours.
Sure.
And then
Exactly.
you leave them out.
Yeah,
And then you have 1
exactly.
hour in the morning and 1 hour in the afternoon where you could use that time, at least so that it's not in 8 hours. You try to give them 10, so they have a little bit more time to kind of develop all those things that they have to. And you use that time wisely, because then it gets, you create this anxiety or these anxious employees because you need to be perfect in your 8 hour time frame.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And you operate in how many countries now?
Right now, 3: Guatemala, Colombia, and Venezuela. It's 18 cities in the three
Okay.
countries.
Wow, that's what Can you share with us what the next country is?
Well, we're working very hard to make it Mexico. That's the
Okay.
next step.
Yeah, traffic in Mexico City is that
It's
is quite
crazy.
something.
And then again,
And
it's the largest market in Latam, in Spanish-speaking Latam.
absolutely, absolutely. And when you think about expansion, right? Was there ever a time where your model, the economic model that you use, was there ever a time that you expanded into a city and the model just didn't work?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Colombia was the case. It's very hard to leverage the aggregate demand and the supply in Colombia, just because of all the regulation around transport.
Okay.
So we had to, when we came in, it was tough. The first year and a half was very tough. We're now growing and making it work in Colombia, fortunately enough. But it was hard because that regulation limits a lot the space of innovation. So, and I'll give you an example. We do what we call, in Guatemala and Venezuela, we're able to deploy what we call open networks, which is, it's not only the employer that can pay, but you as an employee, if it makes sense for you as a commuting alternative, you can acquire the monthly membership of Wawa to ride in our network. But in Colombia, you can't. So it has to be worked exactly only through the companies. And that doesn't allow us to do all the optimization opportunities of having B2C and B2B on the same space.
Oh, okay. 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 Yeah, that's interesting. What was your biggest learning from the entry into Colombia?
Wow. First, that you need a local team. So the first time that we tried, it was a kind of a task force that went in to deploy the solution, and it didn't work out as we thought it would. So you do need that local team, that local culture to be part of it. And then the second, which we learned for the case of Guatemala, is, and that's why we value a lot having family offices in our cap table, is that also the right investor, and if it's an investor tied to the country in Latin America, has a lot of value. And that's why I value a lot that Volcano Summit makes such an effort to create a track for family offices. Because I do think that we have to leverage a lot more family capital as a promoter and enabler of the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Latin America. We did not have that in Colombia. We did have it in Guatemala, and the effect was dramatically in terms of the scale and the pace of growth, because you have that local help and that local kind of back to or shoulders to support you when you're doing that initial landing.
Gotcha. And just for listeners, listening to the episode, Volcano Summit is one of the largest, most prestigious tech kind of sustainability and investment events that happens every year in Latin America. It's kind of like the South by Southwest of Central America, and it's an amazing event that fuses kind of like sustainability with investment, with startups, with pitches. So fabulous place. And then family offices; those are the organizations that pool the capital of very successful families that own businesses to invest that capital into startups, into technology, into funds, those kind of things. So if you think of the most successful families in the world, be they the Waltons or the Rockefellers, et cetera, they all have these family offices which manage and operate their money. Super interesting. I want to kind of like switch kind of like hands now and go a little bit more into your journey as a founder, right? And You mentioned something that stuck with me at the beginning of this conversation, which is the challenge around loneliness for founders. And I don't think that people who are considering starting a business think of that as a challenge, right? They think of capital. They think of, can I get the right team? Can I raise money? Can I build this thing? Can I get customers? I don't think a lot of founders think about how lonely the journey is. Can you expand a little bit on, when you think about loneliness, what did that mean to you? Why did you struggle with that? How did you compensate for that? How did you deal with that as a founder?
So I guess the first one is that what makes you feel lonely is that you're at the top of the food chain of the decisions, right? And in the end, you're applauded when it's good, but you're also very criticized when it's bad. So and that's part of it, right? That's why you get into this, and that feels lonely because in the end, you build teams and you bring investors and you have stakeholders that are you bring them into the equation and most of the
Hmm.
time into your vision, right? Because this is a
Right.
dream that you have and that's the reason why you pursue it. And they're very supportive, but at the same time, that you're going to be scrutinized for what you do, and that's part of the responsibility that you have. And I have a coach that I mentioned that has worked for me for 10 years and has helped us, my wife and I, quite a lot in our process of working together and being co-founders, Michael Melamed, who I remember he once told me a story about Moses and how he took the Jewish population through the desert. But when he was going to enter the promised land, he got mad at God at some point in a conversation. This is obviously a passage in the Bible, and he broke his baton, his I don't know how do you call it, el
Yeah,
baton.
it's tough.
Yeah, exactly. And he wasn't able, and God punished him by not entering the promised land after spending 40 years leading the Jewish population into the promised land. And he told me that in the context of talking precisely about loneliness. And he said, well, that's why you need to be very smart emotionally, because you cannot lose it. You cannot break that at that moment, even though you feel like you want to, that you need to get it out because you're also stressed, because you're also a human being. Well, you
Yeah.
have to understand the consequences of losing it. and
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
that's something that you need to reflect constantly on, because then you can feel very lonely in your feelings and not being able to express them. But it's not about that. It's about you understanding the responsibility that you have and how you have to work with it. So, and it is part of the journey, but I think it's also part of what you enjoy when you know that this is about driving change.
Yeah. And I think when I think about the entrepreneurial journey, I've been through it several times, a couple of times successfully, many more times unsuccessfully. And, I think what people forget out there is that, fear is the thing that stops people from starting a company, right? But what determines whether they succeed is really resilience, right? It's like a marathon. It's the ability to go the distance, to stay with it day after day after day after day. And I think, from what you're telling me, there's obviously the mission and the purpose of the company is very important. The team is very important, but then, having somebody on your side, like a coach, like a mentor, who could potentially see things that you don't see, who can challenge you no matter how senior you are, when many
Definitely.
people will no longer challenge you because they're like, oh my God, how could I challenge Juan Jose?
Definitely.
He's the founder of the company. That turns out to be invaluable. And what I found in Silicon Valley is, people had been telling me for years that I should get a coach. When I was at Google, they started telling me you should
Yeah.
have a coach. And I was like, nah, I'm at Google, I have an inside MBA. I don't need a
Right.
coach. I have all the answers.
Right.
Until my wife left and I got fired and I had all the answers. After that, I
Yeah,
had no answers.
exactly.
Right. So definitely having somebody, call it a coach, call it a mentor, whatever, that can help you see what you don't see is invaluable. And
No,
in
and
your
that
own
connected
journey.
me with your story, by the way. I think when we spoke in
Yeah.
Guatemala, to be frank, when you
Yeah.
told me about your work and how you approached that conversation with entrepreneurs and even your journey, I mean, I think there was an instant connection, because it's good to hear someone that also wants to give back after having that experience. That also is not very common.
Yeah. I mean, look, I was so traumatized by all of it. Not to mention my arrogance at thinking that I could solve it
Right.
on my own. That I ended up completely changing directions in my career and becoming a coach and then writing a book because I had all this PTSD that I needed to put on pages. But one of the things I've most admired about our conversation and your journey was your ability to co-found and run a company with your wife. I found that extraordinary. I tried and failed miserably. So what are the 2 or 3 things that you think you have done well, or you've both done well, that has made this husband and wife relationship work in the context of not just keeping your marriage together and keeping your business together?
Right. So definitely, it's been tough. I think the first one is we do respect a lot the space, each person's space and influence in the company and role in the
Right.
company.
Right.
So Mafe knows that I'm more on the visionary side, tech side, product side. I know that she's amazing at driving execution, especially in the commercial and marketing side. And we respect that, if there is something that is on that space, I might think differently. And I know that you're trying to do your best and you're the expert on that. So it's a lot about understanding what are the strengths of each one. Then the second one is definitely also getting a coach, because when and I think we talked about this a little bit in our last conversation. When you're with your partner, I think the tough side is that the conversation. I mean, work and home are not different spaces. So you're always bringing and having the work conversation even at home. You try not to, but it's present. So having someone that you can talk to about those issues, whether they're personal or professional, that it's not your husband or your wife, helps a lot, kind of reduce the pressure.
Right.
Because then in the conversation, that might get it might be a conflict that actually of interest, because you might, if your wife comes and she's mad at something that happened in the company, and that's something that you see differently or you value differently, or even you were part of it, then you might feel it as personal, right? So even if you don't want to. So I think that kind of getting help in that process from day one has been something very, very important for us. And the third element is that, even when you bring that conversation back home, I do think one of the strengths of working with your wife or with your partner is that now they understand also the journey that you're
Exactly.
transiting. Because I do know that for a lot of entrepreneurs where it's not the case that they co-found with their wives or husbands, is that maybe the other person doesn't understand why you are up until 1 a.m, writing a memo to an investor, and they're like, why are you losing? Like, you have to be with the kids, or you have to be with me, or in this case, you're building the same thing. So you understand, there is a lot of understanding happening in the back end of that.
It's very interesting because I was listening to, I only listened to one podcast, which is the Diary of a CEO by Steve Bartlett, which I absolutely love and recommend to everybody. And he talked about it in one of his episodes. He talked about the fact that, you either have to have a girlfriend or a partner that is in the business with you and therefore understands everything and lives it the way you do, like you just said with your wife.
Yeah.
Or the opposite, somebody who's completely out of it, and who basically, the minute you get home or the minute you're done working, is that you have to hit that off switch, and they help you hit that off switch, and they help you disconnect completely from the business. It's like you can't have something in between, right? So
in between doesn't work. In between, it's gonna take you down, definitely.
So your coach is like almost, and does he coach both of you, or just one of you, or does he coach you both at the same time?
He started with me back when I created Vikua.
Yeah.
Then he met Mafe, and as I always say, Mafe everyone that knows her values how strong she is as a woman and what she does. As you can imagine, being a woman in a startup that is about public transport, mass transit, and so on, it's difficult. I mean,
that's hard.
It's not a woman's space. What's funny
being
enough
a woman in any startup is hard, but being a woman in this startup, and this one gives it is even harder.
A second level of complexity because they're not used to having women in that space. So she's breaking a lot of barriers in that sense. So this coach also kind of met her and said, "Look, let's work together on this process." Then we obviously, this hasn't also been a peachy ride. We've had our turmoils in the process and our conflicts, because we started Wawa when our first kid was born. So imagine how tough it is. You're just becoming parents.
Chile, Wawa means baby.
It means baby, yes. And we have a saying in Venezuela that, the kids come with a bread under their arm. And I always joke that mine came with a bus. So, and that's how difficult he made it for us, right? So it was in that context, we had a very, very difficult first year adjusting to all these changes, simultaneously. And I think Michael was a blessing in that sense, by helping us separately and together. And that's we did have that conversation where sometimes it was about draining somewhere else, and at the same time it was about creating new ways of communicating now on the professional and personal levels.
And look, I have to ask, obviously, because, as you know, this show is all about the messy middle of success, right? One of the things that we like to explore on Mork Unfiltered is getting through the mess. In your own journey now, and you've been an entrepreneur for some time, can you remember what has been so far your darkest moment as an entrepreneur? And if so, how did you get through it?
That's several. One was, the first one was the first time I got my heart broken as co-founder, because when you start a business, you kind of feel that your co-founder is like a marriage. And I'm a very Catholic guy. I believe
minus the sex, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Minus the sex. Exactly. Well, in this startup, I added the sex, right? It was
exactly. You had all the benefits.
Yeah, exactly. In that case, I think it was tough because when I started my entrepreneurial journey, I thought it was amazing to be entrepreneurs with your best friends and the people that you cared about. And that's tough because running a business is about those tough decisions, and friendship is not the same as running a business. And well, I think that first time was really heartbreaking for me because it was the first time I realized that I had to grow up, and those were two separate spaces where to develop, and that you can, lose friends just because in business things are very different, the ways that you handle them, you approach them, and so on. So for me, that was a first time in the journey where it was dark personally, because I felt kind of betrayed, I would say. And then I understood that was just me and my ego, and kind of plays that wasn't helping me build the next type of relationships that I wanted to build going forward. And then the second was, I think, in Wawa, as I mentioned, first kid, we started Wawa that was about 9 months going into Wawa. We only had runway for 10 days.
Wow. Yeah.
Money didn't
That's
come
tough.
in. It wasn't, and that meant, in my case, I didn't have a fallback plan because my wife also worked in Wawa, and I was also co-founder.
Yeah.
So it's not like, you keep your job and I'll try this, and if it doesn't work, it's fine.
There's no plan B, plan A. Yeah.
Plan B is plan A. And then I just recently had a kid. So, and he was just he had just turned 1 year old at that time. And I thought we were gonna fail. And the money came in exactly the last day of funds that we had available. And it was like God saying, I want you to keep forward and to keep pushing. And that was very tough.
What did you do to be able to push through until that last day? I mean, certainly you must have had moments when you thought, this is it, we're going to shut down.
That's a good question. I kept thinking of the good that we were doing, and how much we still had left to do. And that kept me moving forward. I was like, it's not, I know I have to keep pushing. I know I have to keep trying. Even if me and Muffet, we stay alone in this, and the rest of our co-founders stay alone at this time in this endeavor, we lose the team or whatever, we have to keep going because I know that the problem that we're solving needs to be solved. And to be honest, that's when connecting with purpose, that's what purpose does. That in the darkest moments, you see the light because that guides you.
Yeah, it's funny. It goes back to the purpose of why you started the company, right? Which is why I asked the question initially, because I think, the toughest founders, the most resilient founders I found are guided by this sense of calling. Right. On the other hand, and then
exactly.
And then the other thing that, you seem to allude to, which is something that I talk about, in my keynote at Volcano, I talk about the 5 pillars of resilience. And the last pillar is faith, right? It's I don't know if you prayed at that point, but, the belief in something greater than ourselves, the belief that, we can't control everything sometimes it gives us that extra little bit of energy and the gas tank to keep going. I don't know if that was your case, but
it was exactly my case. It was, and I to be frank, I always have this conversation with one of our investors in Vikua. He's an agro-industrialist in Venezuela, amazing guy. Julio must be like 78 or 8. He's already an old guy. And I remember one time that he said to me, your biggest challenge as a CEO, as a leader of a company, is to maintain the faith of everyone around you. So you're a manager of faith. That's what he's
you're the chief motivator.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
But he used it, he
It's
used the
so
word faith in on purpose. So
interesting.
he was saying that, it was about understanding that everyone around you need to also be able to see that light in the moment where the darkest times are, because you're not going to be able to do this alone. Even if you push hard and you push forward, if you stay alone in that process, you're probably going to end alone, because companies are built by people and by
Absolutely.
teams and by the people that join you in that journey.
What's when people start to lose that faith, or when people are scared, which often
Yeah.
happens in startup, right? It's like all of a
Yeah.
sudden we're going to run out of money, or it's really, really tough, or we have a competitor that's taking market share, or all of a sudden we have to change the way we do something very quickly because it's no longer working. When that fear shows up, what techniques or tools have you used to get people to refocus and to get people to overcome their fear?
I have one. I have only used one every single time, and it's provide as much information as possible, as
Okay.
much to the
Massive
very detail,
communication.
massive communication with a lot of detail and a lot of data, and showing that I try to take people to the factual side of things, because most of the times that moment where everyone has fear, you also have it, by the way. But if you move beyond or see beyond that fear, you've seen everything that you've accomplished, and you see all the good things that are there. And those elements help you say, look, I know I do feel this fear in me, but there are reasons not to feel it. So when it's something so emotional as fear or anxiety, I try to manage it with a lot of the rational side of things. It might be counterintuitive, because a lot of people would probably enter more on the motivational speech, like a general on the wartime. I'm more of a, the strategist, showing you that fear can be overcome, because there's something that sustains what we're doing, and that kind of can build up even if that fear
Right.
exists.
So over communicate and explain things very rationally so people
Exactly.
understand what's
Exactly.
happening and why.
And I make a huge
Um,
effort on that. I mean, being transparent on numbers, being transparent on this is it. Look, this is the why. I think that explaining the why of things, because also I believe that fear comes a lot from asymmetry of information among
yeah,
different
absolutely.
people in the company, right? It's the unknown that
Exactly.
you want
Exactly.
to at least turn into a known unknown, so that reduces the anxiety levels of people.
Yeah, it's very true what you say. To me, it's shocking how even in the smallest organizations, when people don't have information, they will literally start to make up shit in their head
Exactly.
to
Exactly.
explain it. And so
Exactly.
if you don't step in as a CEO and constantly communicate, and I'm not saying communicate via email and Slack, which is what most CEOs do. It's like,
Correct. No,
you
no.
have your town hall meetings, you have a Zoom call, you have a meeting with everybody, and you tell them what's going on. It's like basically nature abhors a vacuum, right? So when there's a vacuum and an asymmetry of information, they will create their own stories if you don't step
Exactly.
in and tell them what's happening. That's
Exactly. And
absolutely
imagine
true.
it as a network
Mhm.
of stories that are,
Yep.
I mean, that's the level of craziness that, from in a social perspective, and that happens in politics, that happens in
Yep.
everything that we see in
Yep.
social media. That's what virality is about. It's also
Absolutely.
about something coming out and then everyone making the story or their own perception of what that story is, and then that gets amplified. That is I think in the entrepreneurial context, that's something that you need to reduce as much as possible.
Absolutely.
There are times when it's valuable, though, because you get creative and so on. But in these time of crisis, at least, I feel it's about making it rational, over communicated, and very factual. The thing that
Absolutely.
helps.
Absolutely. Juan Jose, I know that we're over time, so I have
Yeah,
one
yeah.
last question to you before we jump into what I call the lightning round of super
Super.
quick questions and then wrapping up. So, my last question to you, what's your message to Venezuelans or Latin Americans, for that matter, who might be considering starting a business in a tough circumstance? If you could tell them anything to encourage them to take that leap of faith, what would you tell them?
I think we all need to follow a calling, and that calling is given by also the context that we're in. And it's that in our countries, everything that doesn't happen adequately or as you think it should be or as you imagine it, you cannot leave it to someone else. I mean, they're leaving your fate to someone else or something else, in the sense of not God, but in the sense of the structural things around you, the material things around you. I think we are in the right space to create, in the right space to innovate, and if there are problems, there is certainly someone that needs of your service to solve those problems.
Thank you so much. This is great. I always close the show with 3 very quick questions. They
Okay.
require just very short and simple answers.
Super.
They're always fun. I always ask the same question to people.
Okay.
Let's see. I'm curious to see your response. But our lightning round of questions. Question number 1. If you had a superpower, it could be anything.
Okay.
What would it
Anything.
be? Any
Okay.
superpower. If you had one superpower, what would it be?
It would be to read people's minds.
That one's very common. Okay.
I can imagine,
Cool.
but it would be.
It's a very, oh yeah, I would love to have that, especially with my kids.
Exactly. I was exactly thinking of that. I was thinking
With my son, I wish I could read his mind. So
I had this morning a thing with my son, and that's why I was thinking about that. It was like he's very quiet on the thing. So you ask him, how did school go? And he wasn't like, he was giving nothing.
yeah,
And it turns out that a little girl helped him, and so it was like,
Yeah.
I need to read your mind, man.
maybe there's an app for that backed by AI at some point. Question number 2. If you could have dinner with one famous person, living or
Okay.
dead, who would it be?
Well, the thing is, it would be my great grandfather. He was a great writer back in 1930s in Venezuela. He wrote a lot about the political, fighting tyrannies and dictatorships. And I never got to meet nor him or my grandfather. So there was a lot of family history that was lost. And I feel a calling every time I think of my last name and my person of kind of reviving a little bit of what he did and what he fought for. So.
Okay. And last lightning round question is, what's the greatest learning that you have ever had from a personal setback or failure?
I would say that it's that your ego. I mean, it's cliche, but I've lived it. Ego is your worst enemy. I mean, staying humble is just so important, and understanding that it's not about you. It's not about you. Make it everything about yourself, especially in this journey because you're the visionary, you're the founder. So everyone is made up to kind of look up to you and to what you say. But that could turn out really bad if you don't control your ego.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Juan, thank you so much for joining us today and for being so open about the highs, the lows, your journey, your kids, your relationship, all the things that you've done. Your story really is proof that even in the most difficult environments, innovation, resilience, and purpose really thrive with a good dose of faith, I would add.
Yeah.
So I wish you and La Wawa, your baby, a lot of continued success as you guys shape the future of mobility. I really admire everything that you've achieved. I think you're, an inspiration for other entrepreneurs, not just in Venezuela, but across the region. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing your time with us. And I hope you have, great continuation of this amazing ride, and hope to see you again on another episode of Mork Unfiltered.
Thank you, Patrick. It's been amazing talking with you.
Thank you so much. Likewise. And folks, you heard it here. This is an amazing story. Check out the show notes and details in the description of this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and share this episode if you found something that was super compelling, eye-opening, or one of these aha, oh my God moments. Make sure to leave us some feedback. If you have any comments or questions for myself or for Juan José, leave them in the comments section. We will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for everything, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.